The massive doors of the council chamber slid open with a sound that echoed through the enormous space like thunder rolling across mountains. Jake Morrison stepped inside and felt his breath catch in his throat, despite all his preparation and training. The chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen in his 42 years of life. Crystal walls rose hundreds of feet above him, and they glowed with colors that had no names in any human language. The floor beneath his boots was smooth as glass, and it reflected the strange lights dancing across the ceiling, where alien constellations moved in patterns that hurt his eyes when he tried to follow them too closely. He walked forward with measured steps, and his Earth Federation uniform felt suddenly very plain and very human in this place where 12 different alien species gathered to decide the fate of worlds. Jake had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and he had learned 73 alien languages through neural implants that still gave him headaches when he used them for too long. He had studied alien customs until he could recognize a Vethic threat display from a Vethic greeting, and he knew which species considered eye contact respectful and which considered it a challenge to ritual combat. He carried Earth's petition in a sealed case that hung from his shoulder, and inside that case were documents translated into every language the Council used, along with gifts of human art and music and scientific discoveries that Earth hoped would prove their worth to the galactic community. The Council members sat in a semicircle on raised platforms that made them loom over any petitioner who stood in the center of the chamber where Jake now walked. The Vethic held the highest seat, and their representative was a creature named Krothak, who stood nearly 9 feet tall even while sitting down. His scales shifted colors as Jake approached, and they moved from deep blue to crimson and back again in waves that Jake's training told him meant the alien was measuring him like a predator measures prey before deciding whether to strike or ignore. The Zafari floated in tanks of luminescent fluid, and their jellyfish bodies pulsed with bioelectric energy that powered their immense brains. The Krell were insectoid nightmares with 4 arms, each ending in blades that could cut through steel, and their compound eyes tracked Jake's every movement with mechanical precision. Jake stopped at the marked spot in the center of the chamber, and he placed his right hand over his heart in the human gesture of respect that he had been told the Council would understand. He had practiced this moment 1,000 times in simulations back on Earth, but no simulation could capture the weight of knowing that billions of humans were depending on what happened in the next few hours. Earth wanted membership in the Galactic Council, and that membership would bring faster than light travel technology and advanced medical treatments that could cure diseases that still killed millions, and protection under galactic law that would prevent hostile species from invading human space. Without Council membership, Earth would remain isolated and vulnerable, and eventually some aggressive species would decide that humanity's homeworld would make a nice addition to their empire. Krothak spoke first, and his voice came through Jake's translator device as a flat, emotionless rendering of what Jake's training told him was actually dripping with contempt. The alien scales had settled on a pattern of red and black that meant irritation mixed with a sense of superiority. His words were simple and brutal, and they cut through all of Jake's careful diplomatic preparations. Like a knife through paper, Earth had nothing to offer, and humanity was too violent and too divided and too primitive to deserve a place among civilized species. The Council had reviewed Earth's petition, and they had found it lacking in every meaningful way. Humans fought wars among themselves, and they polluted their own planet, and they had only recently stopped testing nuclear weapons in their own atmosphere, like children playing with fire in a house made of kindling. Why should the Council waste time and resources on a species that could not even manage to unite under a single planetary government? Jake delivered his prepared response, and he spoke of human resilience and creativity, and the unique perspective that Earth could bring to galactic civilization. He talked about Earth's biological diversity, and how human scientists had already made breakthroughs in genetic medicine that might interest Council researchers. He mentioned Earth's strategic location in an unexplored arm of the galaxy, where new resources and new worlds waited to be discovered. He spoke for 20 minutes, and he used every rhetorical technique he had learned and every piece of leverage Earth possessed. The Council listened in silence, and when Jake finished speaking, that silence stretched out until it became uncomfortable and then painful. One by one, the Council members dismissed his arguments like swatting away insects. The Zephyr matriarch called humans emotionally unstable and pointed to Earth's long history of wars and conflicts as proof that humanity could not be trusted with advanced technology. The Krell warlord said humans were too fractious and too individualistic to follow council law, and he predicted that Earth would splinter into rebel factions within a decade of joining the galactic community. Even the smaller species who had themselves been conquered and absorbed by the council showed no sympathy for Earth's petition. Then Krothak made his proposal, and the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop despite the alien environmental controls. The Vethic Supreme leaned forward on his platform, and his scales flashed patterns that Jake's translator couldn't fully interpret, but that made his stomach tighten with instinctive dread. Earth could have membership, but there would be conditions that humanity must accept. Earth's military vessels would be placed under council oversight, and human captains would answer to council commanders. Earth's resources would be cataloged by council science teams, and anything deemed valuable would become council property. And Earth would provide 10,000 human specimens for what Krothak called genetic study and labor assignments. The translator device rendered those last words without emotion, but Jake understood what they meant, and his blood turned cold in his veins. The council wanted slaves, and they wanted Earth to hand over 10,000 people as the price of admission to galactic civilization. They wanted humanity to prove its submission by surrendering its freedom before they would even consider granting the protections and benefits that membership supposedly offered. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, and it was a feeling he had not experienced in 5 years since he left his old life behind. It was the cold, focused rage that had kept him alive through situations that should have killed him a dozen times over. He looked up at Krothak, and he kept his voice steady and clear when he spoke. That was unacceptable, and Earth would not trade freedom for membership, and humanity had come here seeking partnership, not servitude. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, and it crackled with tension like the air before a lightning strike. Several council members leaned forward, and their various sensory organs focused on the lone human standing in the center of their chamber. No petitioner had ever refused council terms, and no primitive species had ever dared to speak with such defiance to the beings who ruled half the galaxy. Krothak's scales flashed violent red, and his voice rose to a roar that the translator rendered as cold fury. How dare this primitive refuse the council's generous offer, and did this human not understand that Earth had no power here and no options and no hope of surviving without council protection? Jake opened his mouth to respond, but he never got the chance to speak, because 2 Krell enforcers emerged from alcoves, hidden in the chamber walls, and they moved with terrifying speed across the polished floor. The first one struck Jake across the face with one of its bladed arms, and the impact sent him sprawling sideways onto the hard crystal floor. His translator device sparked and died, and it skittered away across the chamber, trailing smoke. The second Krell kicked him in the ribs, and Jake felt something crack inside his chest. The beating continued, and it was methodical and brutal, and designed to break bones and spirit without quite killing. The Krell worked in silence, and their blade arms rose and fell with mechanical precision. This was a message being delivered to Earth through Jake's broken body, and the message was simple and clear. The Council did not negotiate with primitives, and defiance would be punished, and Earth would accept subjugation or Earth would be destroyed. Jake lay on the floor, and blood pooled beneath his shattered nose, and his vision blurred from the impacts to his head. Pain screamed through every nerve in his body, and he knew that several ribs were cracked and possibly one lung was punctured. But even through the pain and the shock, he felt that old familiar coldness spreading through his thoughts and sharpening his focus. The Krell thought they were beating a helpless diplomat, but they had made a critical mistake. They had not investigated Jake Morrison's background beyond his diplomatic credentials, and they did not know about the 15 years he had spent doing things that were still classified at the highest levels of Earth's military intelligence. Before Jake Morrison became Earth's diplomatic representative, he had been someone else entirely, and that someone else had learned to kill efficiently and creatively in dozens of different combat situations. That someone else had survived missions that had casualty rates measured in percentages instead of numbers. That someone else had earned medals that could never be publicly displayed, and commendations that were locked in vaults under armed guard. As the Krell raised their blade arms for another strike, Jake allowed himself a grim smile that sent fresh blood running down his chin. The Council had attacked the wrong human, and they were about to learn a very painful lesson about what happened when you cornered Earth's apex predator. The Krell Enforcer's blade arm descended toward Jake's spine, But he was already moving, and years of combat training overrode the pain signals his body was screaming at him. He rolled left, and the blade struck the crystal floor where his back had been a fraction of a second earlier, and the impact sent chips of shattered crystal flying through the air. Jake's right hand shot upward and his palm drove into the joint, where the Krell's lower right arm connected to its thorax, and he felt the exoskeleton crack under the precisely aimed strike. The second Krell hesitated for just a moment, and its compound eyes registered something that did not fit its understanding of how prey should behave. Primitives did not fight back, and weak species did not know Krell anatomy well enough to target the vulnerable joints that even other warrior species struggled to find in combat. That moment of hesitation was all Jake needed, and he swept the first Krell's legs out from under it using the alien's own forward momentum to send the creature crashing into its companion. Both enforcers went down in a tangle of bladed limbs and chittering confusion. Jake pushed himself to his feet, and blood streamed from his broken nose and down the front of his uniform, but his eyes were cold and focused with the kind of clarity that only came from a lifetime of surviving impossible situations. The council chamber erupted into chaos around him, and alarms blared from hidden speakers and more enforcers poured through the doors that lined the massive space. But Jake had done something during his initial entry that no one had noticed because they all assumed he was just another nervous petitioner overwhelmed by the grandeur of the council chamber. He had cataloged every exit and every weapon placement and every defensive position and every piece of architecture that could provide cover or create a choke point. It was an old habit from his years in Earth's Special Operations Division where failing to assess your tactical environment meant dying in that environment. Before becoming a diplomat, Jake Morrison had been Captain Morrison, and before that he had been Sergeant Morrison of the Marine Raiders, and before any official military service, he had grown up in the ruins of Detroit after the water wars turned half of North America into a battlefield over control of the Great Lakes. He had learned to fight at age 12 when gangs controlled the streets and clean water was worth more than gold. He had killed his first person at 14 when 3 men tried to take the water rations his family needed to survive the summer. By age 20, he had stopped counting his kills because the numbers stopped meaning anything, except that he was still alive when so many others were not. The military had recognized his talents early, and they had refined his natural abilities with advanced training that most soldiers never received. They taught him how to kill silently, and how to infiltrate enemy installations, and how to survive for weeks behind enemy lines with nothing but a knife and his wits. They taught him alien anatomy through classified xenobiology courses that most humans did not even know existed. They taught him how to think 3 moves ahead in combat, and how to turn any environment into a weapon. Then, after 15 years of black operations and classified missions and violence that left scars, no medical technology could fully heal. The military had offered him retirement. They said he had done enough and seen enough and that he deserved a chance at a normal life. The diplomatic position had seemed perfect, and it was supposed to be his redemption and his chance to use words instead of weapons to serve Earth. He had buried Captain Morrison deep inside and embraced the role of peaceful envoy. But the council had shattered that illusion with their arrogance and their brutality, and now Captain Morrison was clawing his way back to the surface. Jake grabbed the blade arm he had broken off the first Krell, and it felt balanced and familiar in his grip like the combat knives he had carried on dozens of covert missions across Earth and through hostile alien territories in the outer colonies. 3 more enforcers charged him from different angles, and they moved with the confidence of beings who had never lost a fight, because nothing in the known galaxy could match Krell's speed and strength and armor. They had not evolved new tactics in 10,000 years because they had never needed to adapt when their natural advantages made them apex predators on any battlefield. Jake moved through them like water flowing around stones, and he used the first enforcer's momentum against it by sidestepping and driving the captured blade into the joint between its head and thorax. The second enforcer managed to land a blow that cracked 2 more of Jake's ribs, but it died a moment later, when Jake severed the neural cluster at the base of its abdomen. The third enforcer was smarter than its companions, and it tried to grapple Jake instead of using its blades. But Jake had trained in zero-gravity combat against opponents twice his size, and he broke the Krell's grip and threw it into the chamber. While hard enough to crack both the wall and the enforcer's exoskeleton, the Galactic Council watched in stunned silence from their raised platforms, and several members stood up from their seats, and their various forms of alarm were obvious even across the barriers of species and language. This was impossible according to everything they knew about humans and primitive species and the natural order of galactic civilization. Humans were supposed to be weak and slow and clumsy compared to the warrior species that enforced council law. Yet this single human was dismantling elite Krell enforcers with brutal efficiency that spoke of training and experience that should not exist among such a primitive species. Krothak's scales flashed white with shock and then black with rage, and his voice thundered through the chamber even without a working translator. More enforcers poured into the space, and they numbered at least 20 now, and they surrounded Jake in a tightening circle of blades and armor. Jake assessed his situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through worse odds. He was injured and bleeding, and he had no backup and no escape route, and he was facing opponents who were individually stronger and faster than any human. But he also had something they lacked, and that was desperation combined with experience fighting enemies who had every advantage except one. He knew how to win when winning should be impossible. He led the enforcers toward the observation windows that lined one wall of the chamber, and the massive panels of transparent material looked out into the void of space where the council station orbited a dying star. The enforcers followed him because they thought he was trapped, and they moved in standard formation that Jake recognized from intelligence briefings about Krell military tactics. They relied on overwhelming force and superior numbers, and they assumed their prey would break and run or freeze in terror. Jake did neither, and instead he did something that made even the battle-hardened Krell pause in confusion. He grabbed an emergency environment suit from an alcove near the windows, and these suits were required by galactic law to be placed near any potential breach points on space stations. He clutched the suit's deployment handle against his chest with his left hand, while his right hand still held the Krell blade. Then he turned toward the observation window and he ran straight at it. The enforcers realized his intention a moment too late, and they charged after him, but Jake was already moving. He struck the window with the blade at the precise point where the frame connected to the crystal panel, and the structural weakness he had noticed during his initial assessment. The window held for 1 second, and then 2, and then it shattered outward in an explosive decompression that sucked air and debris and Krell enforcers toward the void of space. Jake let the explosive rush of escaping atmosphere propel him through the shattered window and out into the vacuum, and he tumbled away from the station in a chaotic spin. Behind him, emergency bulkheads slammed down to seal the breach, and the surviving enforcers scrambled for safety. Ahead of him was nothing but empty space and certain death for any unprotected human. But Jake Morrison had not survived 42 years of violence and war by accepting certain death as an actual certainty. He had studied the medical reports about vacuum exposure during his military training, and he knew he had about 90 seconds before brain death became irreversible. He also knew that the emergency suit in his hand was designed for exactly this kind of disaster. 45 seconds into his free fall through space with his lungs collapsed and his blood boiling and ice crystals forming on his exposed skin, Jake squeezed the deployment handle. The emergency suit exploded around his body, and smart fabric bonded to his skin and clothes and created a pressurized cocoon. Built-in reservoirs released breathable atmosphere, and medical nanites flooded his bloodstream to repair the damage that vacuum exposure had caused. Jake sucked in a desperate breath, and pain exploded through his chest, but in meant he was alive, and alive meant he still had a chance. The suit's heads-up display flickered to life and showed his trajectory and nearby objects. Directly ahead, and exactly where he had calculated it would be during his 3-year preparation for this mission, was a cargo hauler docked at the station's lower pylon. Jake fired the suit's maneuvering thrusters, and the small compressed gas jets pushed him toward the hauler. He had one shot at this, and if he missed, he would drift into deep space with maybe 6 hours of life support and no rescue coming. He hit the hauler's hull hard enough to crack his already damaged ribs again, but the magnetic grips in the suit's gloves and boots engaged automatically. For a long moment, Jake just hung there against the cold metal, and he breathed hard and took stock of his injuries. Everything hurt, and his medical training told him he had severe bruising and broken bones and early decompression trauma. But nothing was immediately fatal, and that meant he could keep moving. Through the suit's external audio pickups, he heard the station's emergency broadcasts, and they were announcing a full lockdown and deploying search ships to recover his body, which they assumed would be floating dead somewhere in the debris field. They did not know about the emergency suit, and they did not know he had survived, and they certainly did not know he had been trained in hostile vessel infiltration by Earth's best special operations instructors. Jake worked his way along the cargo hauler's hull toward an external maintenance hatch that he could see about 50 meters away, and his magnetic grips held firm against the metal surface with each careful movement. Every ship that traveled through space had these hatches for emergency repairs during transit, and they were also a well-known security vulnerability that pirates and military boarding teams exploited on a regular basis. Jake had used maintenance hatches to infiltrate enemy vessels at least a dozen times during his years in special operations, and he knew exactly how to bypass the basic locks that protected them. He reached the hatch and pulled a multi-tool from the emergency suit's equipment pouch, and the tool was not designed for hacking, but Jake had learned long ago that any tool could become a weapon or a key if you understood how to use it properly. He wedged the tool's edge into the hatch seal and applied pressure at the weak point where the locking mechanism connected to the frame. 15 minutes of careful work, and the hatch cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Jake pulled himself inside and sealed the hatch behind him, and then he stood in the narrow maintenance corridor while the hauler's atmosphere rushed back into the space around him. He stripped off the emergency suit and felt the ship's artificial gravity pull at his injured body, and every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his broken ribs and bruised organs. He found a storage locker and pulled out coveralls that were too short in the legs and too wide in the shoulders, but they would pass a casual inspection better than his torn and blood-stained Earth Federation uniform. The cargo hauler was a maze of corridors and cargo holds and crew quarters, and Jake moved through them with the silent efficiency that had kept him alive during countless infiltration missions. He stuck to maintenance shafts and service tunnels, where crew members rarely ventured, and he avoided the main corridors where he might encounter someone who would ask questions. The crew numbered about 20 based on the ship's size, and they were a mix of species that Jake recognized from his diplomatic briefings. They were civilians and merchants who probably had no idea their vessel was docked at the station where Earth's diplomatic mission had just turned into a violent incident that would echo across the galaxy. Jake needed 3 things, and he needed them fast before the Council figured out he was still alive. He needed information about what was happening on the station and back on Earth. He needed supplies and medical treatment for his injuries. And he needed a way off this hauler before it departed for wherever it was scheduled to go next, because every hour he stayed hidden was another hour Earth spent in the dark about the danger coming their way. He found an empty crew quarter, and the occupant was probably on duty somewhere else in the ship, and Jake slipped inside and locked the door behind him. He found a medical kit in the wall compartment, and he treated his injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had patched himself up in worse conditions. He bound his ribs with elastic wrapping that would hold the broken bones in place while they healed. He set his broken nose by gripping it firmly and pushing until he heard the cartilage click back into alignment, and the pain made his vision go white for several seconds. He injected himself with a broad-spectrum pain reliever that would take the edge off without dulling his reflexes. Then he turned to the crew quarters data terminal, and this was the risky part, because accessing the terminal would leave traces that could be tracked back to this location. But Jake needed to know what was happening, and he needed information more than he needed safety. His diplomatic credentials had included high-level security clearances that allowed him to access Council networks, and he had memorized the encryption keys during his preparation for the mission. If those clearances had not been revoked yet, he might be able to access the station's communication systems. The terminal accepted his credentials without hesitation, and Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with grim satisfaction. The Council was so arrogant and so convinced of their own superiority that they had not even thought to immediately revoke his access. He pulled up files on the Council's response to what they were calling an unprovoked attack by a human diplomat on peaceful Council proceedings. What Jake found made his blood run cold, despite all his years of combat experience and all the horrors he had witnessed. The Council was broadcasting their version of events across the entire galaxy, and they were painting humanity as violent and unstable and dangerous to the established order. They claimed Jake had attacked without provocation and killed several Krell enforcers in a berserker rage that proved humans were too primitive and too aggressive to be allowed into galactic civilization, They were mobilizing a punitive fleet to contain the human threat, and that fleet would arrive at Earth in approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks before 200 Council warships arrived at Earth's doorstep with orders to blockade the planet and possibly invade if humanity refused to surrender. Earth had 5 ships capable of faster-than-light travel and a few dozen orbital defense platforms that were designed to stop asteroids and space debris, not military-grade plasma weapons. Against a Council fleet, Earth would last maybe an hour before the planetary defenses were overwhelmed. Jake thought about his sister Katie, who taught elementary school in New Chicago, and his nephew Danny, who was only 8 years old and loved to draw pictures of spaceships. He thought about his niece Sophie, who wanted to be a doctor and help people. He thought about the billions of humans who had no idea that war was coming to their world, because one diplomat had refused to accept slavery as the price of joining galactic civilization. But as Jake dug deeper into the Council's classified networks, he found something else, and it was information that changed everything. He followed digital breadcrumbs through encrypted databases and hidden files, and what he discovered was a pattern that stretched back centuries. The Council's invitations to join galactic civilization were never genuine offers of partnership. They were carefully planned subjugation campaigns that targeted species on the verge of achieving interstellar capability. The pattern was always the same, and Jake found records of dozens of species who had followed the same path Earth was now on. The Council would invite them to apply for membership and then set impossible standards that no species could meet. When the applicants inevitably failed or refused the exploitative terms, the Council would use that failure as justification for military intervention. They called it peacekeeping or stabilization or protection of galactic order, but the result was always the same: conquered worlds and enslaved populations and resources flowing back to enrich the founding Council members. The Yethrin homeworld was now a strip mining operation that had been stripped of everything valuable and left as a barren rock. The Solari people were scattered across the galaxy as indentured labor working in factories and mines and farms owned by Council corporations. The Mikhail civilization had been completely erased, and their cities were ruins, and their language was extinct, and their culture was nothing but footnotes in Council historical databases. Dozens of species, and all of them following the same tragic pattern of hope and betrayal and subjugation. But Jake found something even more important hidden in those classified files, and it was evidence that could prove everything. There were recordings of Council debates where they openly discussed the deliberate impossibility of their membership requirements. There were financial records showing how conquered species resources enriched the Council's founding members. And most damning of all, there was footage from the Council chamber showing that the Krell enforcers had attacked Jake before he made any aggressive move. The Council had planned the whole incident to create justification for subjugating Earth. Jake spent hours copying files and encrypting them and routing them through a dozen relay stations to hide the signal's origin. He created a data package that contained everything he had found, and he included his own testimony about what had really happened in the Council chamber. Then he sent the package bouncing across the galaxy toward Earth, with Captain Lisa Hayes of the Earth Defense Force cruiser Valiant as the intended recipient. Lisa had served under his command during the Titan Rebellion, when colonists on Saturn's largest moon had tried to break away from Earth's government, and Jake had led the special operations team that ended the conflict. Without a full-scale war, he trusted Lisa to get the information to Earth's government, and he trusted her to understand how important it was. But sending the data was not enough, and Jake knew it. With the certainty that came from years of strategic planning, the Council controlled the major communication networks across the galaxy, and they could suppress inconvenient truths if those truths only existed in classified files that nobody would ever see. Jake needed to do something more dramatic and more public and more impossible to ignore. He needed to escape the station and get back to Earth before the Council fleet arrived, and he needed to bring proof that could not be dismissed or hidden or explained away. That meant stealing a ship and making a 3-week journey across hostile space while the entire Council apparatus hunted for him. Jake studied the station's docking bay. Through security cameras he had hacked, and he looked at hundreds of vessels, ranging from massive cargo haulers to sleek personal yachts, owned by wealthy Council members. He needed something fast enough to reach Earth before the fleet and small enough to be operated by one person, and well supplied enough to survive a 3-week journey. He found it in Dock 23, and it was a courier ship designed to carry priority messages and high-value cargo across vast distances. The ship was perfect except for one problem that made Jake smile grimly despite his situation. It belonged to the Vethic military, and it was currently being loaded for a mission to the frontier territories. Jake watched the loading crew through the security feed, and he waited for them to take their scheduled break. When they finally left the dock, he slipped out of the cargo hauler wearing his stolen coveralls and a maintenance worker's identification badge he had found in a locker. He moved through the docking bay with purpose and confidence because people rarely questioned someone who looked like they belonged and knew where they were going. The courier ship security was laughable by the standards Jake had learned during his military career, and the Vethic had grown complacent after millennia of galactic dominance. Jake bypassed the lock-in under a minute using techniques that were taught to every special operations soldier, and he slipped inside the ship. The interior of the courier ship was cramped and designed for a crew of 2 at most, and Jake moved quickly through the narrow corridors toward the cockpit. He found the navigation computer and started plotting a course to Earth, and his fingers moved across the alien interface with the confidence that came from 3 years of studying Council ship systems. The journey would take 3 weeks at the ship's maximum speed, and he would burn through the fuel reserves completely, but he would make it home with just enough power left for atmospheric entry. Footsteps echoed on the loading ramp behind him, and Jake turned to see a Vethic officer entering the ship. She was smaller than Krothak, but still stood nearly 7 feet tall, and her scales were the professional gray color that Jake's training identified as military bearing. She froze when she saw him, and her hand moved toward the weapon holstered at her belt, and her scales began shifting toward combat red. Jake raised his empty hand slowly and kept his voice calm and steady even though his heart was pounding in his chest. He told her he did not want to hurt her, and he was trying to stop a war between Earth and the Council. He asked her to just let him take the ship and report it stolen, and tell her superiors that he had ambushed her. Her career would be fine, and no one would blame her for losing a ship to a human who should have been dead. But the officer's scales were already darkening to combat crimson, and her hand closed around her weapon, and she was drawing it from the holster. Jake could see in her compound eyes that she had made her decision, and she was going to try to stop him because that was what her training and her duty demanded. She probably thought she could handle one injured human, and she probably believed the Council propaganda about human weakness and primitive fighting skills. Jake moved first and crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. He grabbed her weapon hand before the gun cleared the holster, and he twisted her arm using leverage and momentum to slam her into the bulkhead. She was strong, and her alien muscles were more powerful than human tissue. But Jake had leverage and desperation, and decades of experience fighting opponents who were physically superior. He got the weapon away from her and delivered a precise strike to the neural cluster at the base of her skull, where Vethic nervous systems were vulnerable. She collapsed into unconsciousness, and Jake caught her before she hit the deck. He bound her with cargo straps and left her on the loading ramp outside the ship where the dock workers would find her when they returned from their break. Then he sealed the ship's hatch and ran back to the cockpit and fired the engines. Alarms blared across the docking bay as the courier ship lifted without clearance and without following proper departure protocols. Security forces scrambled, and Jake could see them on the display screens rushing toward their own vessels. Warning messages flooded the communication, channels demanding that he stop and return to the dock. Jake ignored the warnings and punched the throttle to maximum, and the courier ship shot toward the atmospheric containment field that separated the docking bay from open space. Weapons fire lanced past his hull, and the defensive turrets were tracking his movement and trying to disable his engines. A plasma bolt scored a glancing hit on the port side, and the entire ship shuddered, and warning lights flashed across the control panel. But Jake was already through the containment field and into the black void beyond the station. More weapons fire chased him, and pursuit ships were launching from the military docks, and Jake's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. He activated the faster-than-light drive, and the universe twisted around him in ways that human eyes were not designed to perceive. Colors that had no names bent and stretched, and reality folded in on itself. Then the ship leaped forward into hyperspace, and the Council station vanished behind him in a blur of distorted light. Jake collapsed into the pilot's chair and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He had survived the impossible and escaped from the Council's most secure station and stolen vital intelligence that could save his entire species. But the hard part was just beginning, because 3 weeks alone in a stolen ship was plenty of time for things to go wrong in 1,000 different ways. The first week passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion and constant vigilance. Jake treated his injuries with the ship's medical supplies, and the Vethic medicines were not designed for human biology, but he made them work through careful dosing and monitoring. His ribs began to heal and the bruising faded from purple to yellow. His broken nose set crookedly, but at least he could breathe through both nostrils again. The decompression trauma left him with headaches and occasional dizziness, but those symptoms gradually improved. He ate the ship's food stores, and the Vethic rations tasted like burnt plastic mixed with metal shavings, but they kept him alive, and that was all that mattered. He slept in short intervals because the ship's autopilot was not sophisticated enough to handle emergencies, and he needed to monitor the systems constantly. He exercised in the cramped cargo hold to keep his muscles from atrophying during the long journey, and he practiced combat drills because he knew there would be more fighting when he reached Earth. The second week brought new challenges when the ship's communication array picked up Council broadcasts, and Jake spent hours listening to the propaganda being spread across the galaxy. The Council was calling him a terrorist and a murderer, and they were claiming Earth had sent him to assassinate Council members as part of a planned human uprising against galactic civilization. The lies were so absurd that Jake would have laughed if the situation was not so serious. They were building justification for their invasion, fleet, and turning humanity into a threat that needed to be eliminated for the good of all civilized species. But Jake also picked up transmissions from Earth, and he could tell from the encrypted military channels that his data package had reached Captain Lisa Hayes. The Earth Defense Force was mobilizing every asset they had, and the government was evacuating civilians from the major cities in case the Council fleet bombarded population centers. President Williams had made a public address calling for calm and promising that Earth would defend itself against any aggression. The whole planet was preparing for war. During the third week, Jake began preparing for his arrival, and he knew the Council would be watching Earth closely for any sign of him. They would have ships stationed around the planet, and they would shoot down anything approaching without proper authorization. Jake needed a plan to get past those defenses and reach Earth's surface and deliver his evidence to people who could use it. He studied Earth's defensive grid and looked for weaknesses in the orbital coverage. He analyzed the Council fleet's deployment patterns and identified gaps in their sensor coverage. He calculated trajectories that would bring him in fast and low, using Earth's magnetic field to mask his approach. It was risky, and the chances of success were maybe 30%, but 30% was better than zero. On the 21st day of his journey, Earth appeared in the view screen, and Jake felt emotions he had not allowed himself to feel during the escape and the flight. Relief and hope and fear and determination all mixed together in his chest. The planet looked so small and fragile from this distance, and it was hard to believe that humanity's entire future depended on what happened in the next few hours. The courier ship's warning systems screamed at him, and the displays showed critical fuel reserves and compromised hull integrity and life support systems operating at minimal capacity. He had pushed the ship beyond its design limits, and it was barely holding together, but he had made it home, and that was what mattered. Earth Defense Force vessels surrounded him within minutes of his arrival, and Jake heard Lisa Hayes' voice over the damaged communication system. She sounded tense and worried, and she was demanding that he identify himself immediately or be fired upon. Jake transmitted his diplomatic credentials and told her who he was and asked if she had received his data package. There was a long pause that felt like an eternity, and then Lisa's voice came back with a mixture of relief and urgency. Command had received his data 3 days ago, and they had been analyzing it constantly and trying to verify the information. But there was bad news, and the news was worse than Jake had feared. The Council fleet had accelerated their schedule, and they would arrive at Earth in 4 days instead of the original timeline. 200 warships carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, and they were coming to subjugate or destroy humanity. Jake told Lisa to bring him down to Earth immediately, and he needed to speak with Defense Command and the government leadership. He had intelligence, and he had evidence, and he had a plan that might save Earth from invasion. It was desperate and dangerous, and it would require gambling everything on a strategy that had never been tried before. But it was the only chance humanity had. The courier ship descended through Earth's atmosphere with Lisa's vessel flying escort, and Jake watched his homeworld grow larger in the view screen. The blue oceans and green continents and white clouds were the most beautiful things he had ever seen after 3 weeks in the black void of space. He was home and he was alive, and he was carrying information that would either save his species or mark them for extinction. 2 hours later, Jake stood in a conference room deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, and he faced the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Earth Federation Council. His body still ached from his injuries, and his stolen Vethic clothes were stained with sweat and blood, but his mind was sharp and focused. He activated the holographic display and showed them everything he had discovered about the Council's pattern of conquest and their centuries of lies. Jake presented everything he had discovered, and the holographic display showed the Council's pattern of conquest spanning centuries and dozens of subjugated species. He showed them recordings of Council debates where they discussed the deliberate impossibility of their membership requirements. He showed them financial records proving how conquered worlds enriched the founding Council members. He showed them footage from the Council chamber proving the Krell had attacked him without provocation. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, and it painted a picture of systematic exploitation disguised as enlightened governance. General Martinez leaned forward in his chair and studied the data with the hard eyes of someone who had seen combat and understood the stakes. He asked the question everyone was thinking, and it was the same question Jake had been wrestling with during his 3-week journey home. What could Earth do with this information, and how would it stop 200 warships from blockading or destroying their world? Jake activated another display and showed the network of communication relays that connected the galactic community. The Council controlled the major networks, but there were independent systems scattered across the frontier. Pirate relays and colony broadcasts and free trade stations that operated outside Council jurisdiction. There were even resistance networks on subjugated worlds where conquered species kept their cultures alive through secret transmissions. If Earth could flood all those channels simultaneously, with the evidence Jake had gathered, then the entire galaxy would see the truth about the Council. Ambassador Chen objected immediately and pointed out that the Council would just call it propaganda and dismiss it as desperate lies from a primitive species, trying to avoid punishment for attacking Council representatives. No one would believe Earth over the ancient and respected Galactic Council. Jake had expected this objection, and he touched the controls to bring up new information. The subjugated species would recognize their own stories in the evidence, and they would see the same patterns that had destroyed their civilizations. The independent colonies and frontier worlds that barely tolerated Council authority would see proof of what they had always suspected. Earth would not be alone in questioning the Council's legitimacy. Some species might even decide it was time to fight back against their oppressors. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what Jake was proposing. He was not just talking about defending Earth, and he was talking about starting a revolution that could tear apart the galactic order. It was dangerous and desperate, and it could put targets on every human in the galaxy if it failed. President Williams spoke for the first time since Jake had begun his presentation, and her voice was steady despite the weight of the decision she was facing. She said Earth would not go quietly into slavery, and if they were going to fall, then the whole galaxy would know why and would see what the Council really was behind their facade of civilization. Jake spent the next 3 days coordinating with Earth's best communications specialists and computer experts. They prepared the data and translated it into every major galactic language and created packages small enough to slip through security protocols but complete enough to tell the full story. They identified thousands of independent relay stations and resistance networks and pirate channels. They wrote code that would replicate the data and spread it faster than the Council could suppress it. On the 4th day, as Council warships began appearing at the edge of Earth's solar system, they released everything. The galactic communication network exploded with activity as Jake's evidence appeared on news feeds and personal devices and public displays across 10,000 worlds. The Council tried immediately to suppress the information, but it spread faster than they could contain it, and every attempt to shut down one relay just pushed the data to 10 more channels. The reaction was immediate and violent and far more dramatic than even Jake had hoped. On subjugated worlds, populations began rioting and attacking council facilities. On frontier colonies, governments severed communication with council authorities and declared independence. Several of the council's member species began demanding investigations into the allegations and calling for emergency sessions to review membership terms. The Zephyri matriarch herself released a public statement, expressing concern about the evidence and calling for a full inquiry. Most importantly, 3 species that had been conquered within the last century saw documented proof of how they had been betrayed and manipulated. The Solari resistance mobilized its hidden cells across 50 worlds. The Yethran survivors began sabotaging the mining operations on their homeworld. The Mikhail descendants who had been scattered as refugees started broadcasting their own testimonies about what the Council had done to their people. The galaxy was not united against the Council, but for the first time in millennia, the Council's authority was being questioned on a massive scale. The carefully maintained illusion of benevolent governance was cracking, and billions of beings were demanding answers. Jake watched from Earth Defense Command as the Council fleet stopped at the edge of the solar system. They held position instead of advancing, and the diplomatic channels exploded with traffic. Council members were arguing among themselves and debating whether to proceed with an invasion that was now under intense scrutiny. Some wanted to press forward and crush Earth as an example. Others worried that attacking Earth now would validate the evidence Jake had released and turn the Council into the villains of galactic history. Then something happened that no one had predicted, and it changed everything. A single ship broke away from the Council fleet and approached Earth under a flag of truce. It was a Zephyri vessel, and the elegant bioship pulsed with lights that signaled peaceful intentions. The message they sent was simple and direct, and it gave Jake hope for the first time since this nightmare had begun. The Zephyri wanted to negotiate, and they wanted to find a peaceful resolution that would satisfy both Earth and the Council. The negotiations took 3 months, and they were brutal and complex and filled with setbacks. How the Council wanted to save face and maintain their authority. Earth wanted justice and protection and the freedom to develop as an independent species. The subjugated species wanted representation and reparations for centuries of exploitation. The independent colonies wanted guarantees that they would not be targeted next. Jake participated in every session, and he sat across from Krothak and the other Council members who had ordered his beating. He spoke for Earth and for all the species that had been silenced by Council oppression. He presented evidence and made arguments and refused to back down when the Council tried to intimidate him. His broken ribs had healed by then, but the memory of that beating remained sharp, and he used it to fuel his determination. Slowly and painfully, a new framework emerged. Earth would join the galactic community as an equal partner with full rights and protections. There would be no slavery and no forced resource extraction, and no military occupation. Earth would maintain sovereignty over its own military and its own territory. In exchange, Earth would share its scientific discoveries and participate in joint defense agreements and open its markets to galactic trade. But the agreement went far beyond just Earth's membership. The Council was forced to reform its entire structure under pressure from the Zephyri and several other founding species who were horrified by the evidence Jake had exposed. Subjugated species were granted seats at the Council table with full voting rights. The patterns of conquest were officially condemned and banned. A truth and reconciliation process was established to investigate past injustices and provide reparations to victims. It was not perfect, and the changes would take decades to fully implement. Some Council members resigned rather than accept the new order. Some subjugated species remained skeptical that anything would really change, but it was progress. And it was more than anyone had dared hope for when Jake had first stood in that Council chamber 6 months ago. Jake stood in the same Council chamber where he had been beaten, and now it looked different to him. The observer seats were filled with representatives from formerly subjugated species. Independent journalists broadcast every word of the proceedings. The founding Council members sat in their elevated positions, but they looked diminished and uncertain as they faced questions they could no longer ignore. A young Solari woman approached Jake after the final ratification ceremony. She spoke in halting English and told him that her people had believed for 40 years they deserved their fate, because they had failed some impossible test of worthiness. Now they knew the truth, and they could fight for their freedom with hope instead of shame. She thanked him with tears in her eyes, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest where old wounds had lived for so long. He thought about all the people he had killed during his years as a soldier and all the violence he had committed in the name of duty and survival. He thought about the darkness that had lived inside him since he was 14 years old and had taken his first life. He had spent decades being a weapon pointed at whatever target his commanders designated, and he had been very good at destroying things. But maybe in the end, he had managed to be something more than just a killer. Maybe he had been a voice for those who could not speak. Maybe he had been a witness to injustice who refused to look away. Maybe he had proven that the most powerful weapon was not violence at all, but truth spoken loudly enough that it could not be ignored. Jake Morrison walked out of the council chamber and into the plaza beyond, where humans and aliens mixed freely for the first time. The afternoon sun of the alien star system painted everything in shades of amber and gold. He thought about going home to Earth and seeing his sister Katie and his nephew Danny and his niece Sophie. He thought about teaching at the new Diplomatic Academy that Earth was establishing to train the next generation of representatives. He thought about a future where humans could walk among the stars as equals rather than subjects. The war he had spent his whole life fighting was finally over, and the peace he had never believed possible was beginning. Jake allowed himself to smile as he walked through the crowd and disappeared into the flow of galactic civilization that humanity had just joined, not as slaves but as free people who had earned their place by refusing to accept anything less.